Hello. Hopefully you should be able to see me all right and hear me okay. Any issues with audio or visual, please let me know. Sounds like everything's going all right. Just had a couple of messages in to say that's fine. So welcome to the session. My name's Ben from Rare Consulting. We're a research and product development company, and hopefully this is what you're expecting. For those of you that have been before, thanks so much. After 2 weeks ago when we had the issue of the internet, thank you very much for coming back. Apologies for that. Don't know what happened. I do know what happened. Actually, the internet died. But yeah, all good now. We're back in a city where the internet works, so that helps. For those that are new to these sessions, welcome. These are a regular series that we do where we share our data on consumer trends, how the pandemic has impacted people's behaviours, and hopefully you'll find it of interest. So just to give you an idea of what we're going to cover, for those that are new, I'll talk to you a little bit about the project, why we're doing it, and then I'll discuss some of the more recent macro trends we're seeing. As you can appreciate with the whole scenario, things develop, quite quickly. Things change, and this is really a platform for us to be able to disseminate that information on a regular basis to everybody. We'll then go through brand reputation scores, so the latest in terms of how different brands are performing. And then at the end, we're going to do sector deep dives into grocery, alcohol, retail, beauty, entertainment, exercise, and travel in a bit more depth. In terms of what we're doing at Rare, so we've interviewed nearly 14,000 people over the last 3.5 months. So every week we sample between 900 to 1,000 people to understand how they're feeling, how they're behaving in different categories, what their future hopes are. Really paints a very interesting picture of how things have changed, but also gives us a really good flavour of what's going to come next. And I think the historical data that we've got already could well be quite useful depending on what happens in the coming months, because there's a huge amount of uncertainty out there, that's for sure. We're also running our brand reputation trackers, so that's where we're measuring different brands in terms of how they're responding to the pandemic, how people feel about them, and so on. So it's really useful data to sort of see who's doing what and how they perceived. So what type of activities that brands are doing have an impact on their perception. And then we have our diary studies, which we're currently doing one in sports with the IPA, the Institute of Professional Advertisers. And we're looking at how sports fans are engaging now the Premier League is back. I'll give you a bit of a sense of the types of insights we're seeing already from that research, but the larger report will be out towards the end of this month, July, into the second half of the year already. It's pretty mad when you think about it, really, isn't it? So in terms of context, looking at sort of the state of play of things at the moment, there's still a huge amount of uncertainty about what's going to happen, and there's predictions from the Bank of England about a potential V-shaped recovery, and only if employment levels are able to be retained in some way. Of course, people are spending, that's great. However, as uncertainty about jobs becomes clearer, that will have a huge impact in terms of whether that V curve is like this or whether it sort of looks like that, turns into a U curve. Who knows? I think time will tell. But if there's any indication of the severity of the situation, is that with the furlough scheme, or the initial articulation of the furlough scheme, should we say, ended at the end of June. Of course, now there's different rules in place from now on till October as they wind down the scheme. In effect, we saw there were 9,000 redundancies announced in a 24-hour period, which affected the hospitality and retail sectors the most. And some of these, really quite stark. There's 5,000 jobs lost at upper crust yesterday. 700 jobs went from Harrods, 500 from Arcadia Group, 600 job losses at TM Lewin, who are taking all of their sales now online. It's really forced quite a difficult decision to be made when businesses need to sort out their fixed cost base. And I suppose one big knock-on effect really is for the landowners themselves and those leasing out the units who aren't collecting as much revenue as they were before. So it's going to affect lots of aspects of our economy. There is, of course, the threat of new localized flashes of the pandemic coming back. So Leicester's obviously now in lockdown. If you read into the data and you sort of look at things, I mean, I'm, to be perfectly honest, personally, a little bit concerned about what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks. If we're sort of seeing already, without the stimulus of lots of pubs and places being opened, that we have got these flashes in Leicester, potentially Bradford, Barnsley, Rochdale and Bedford to follow as well. So, we do need to be vigilant. And I don't know what it's like where you guys live, but certainly I've found in South East London that it would seem as if in some cases the pandemic never even happened, by the way some people sort of behaving. So, we really are into very uncharted territory. And that, of course, leads us on to the fact that, pubs and restaurants are opening in the next few days and weeks. Not everyone is opening their doors. It will take a bit of time. But that, there's potential for, some serious disorder that goes along with it. So, we really are, it's quite a kind of anxious period at the moment, which is actually reflecting some of the sentiment data we're seeing as well. That comes through. So for anybody, this is in many ways a kind of where we've been to date is a good learning exercise for where we could go. We've got the data now to understand what might happen. We've all experienced when the lockdown might happen again, but equally we need to be able to try and look into the future and start to make bets in terms of what might happen and be prepared for the uncertainty of the way that we do things. So in terms of context, lots of change happening. It's one great big kind of social science experiment, to be honest, and it's going to be, it's going to be interesting and testing to see what happens next. In terms of what consumers look forward to the most, for those who've been in these sessions before, that we're trying to we are tracking people's future intentions and hopes for the future, or what it looks like. And currently, what people are looking forward to is still very much about spending time with friends and family. The data is has been to date been quite kind of emotive. When we ask people what they're looking forward to, the language is often rich with how they describe being able to see friends, touch people, hug people. It's really quite touching and very human in terms of the way they describe things. Certain categories like travel, in terms of consumer categories, rank the top and have been for the past 6 weeks. We are seeing evidence that shopping and the ability to spend on goods has increased as well, as has people looking forward to going to the pub, which has increased 2% in the past 5 weeks. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens next after this weekend, what kind of impact we might see. But certainly we're seeing that the response is becoming less emotive and a little bit more focused on, the kind of practicalities of getting back to life. As lots of people have now been able to experience, human contact, which has seen a slight reduction in the level to which people are looking forward to spending time with their family. And you can see that trended out over time. So that blue line at the top is a qualitative analysis of people who claim they're looking forward to seeing family. Has gone down from it's gone from 41% to 47% the week commencing the 18th of May, and now rests at about 33%. And what we're seeing in the data is that people's future intentions and hopes are really starting to diverge. So they're becoming a little bit more focused around the tasks and missions and interests they have to be able to engage with, less so than it was all about family in the previous weeks. Which brings me on to for me, this is kind of the really interesting part of lots of this is how are we feeling as humans? How are we responding to things? How do we feel? And it's fascinating to see, keep your eye on that top green trend line. So what you see is that levels of worry were at their peak around 13th of April, when we're really into the lockdown and battening down the hatches and sort of trying to cross our fingers for the future. What we're seeing though is that level of worry sort of decreased a little bit, and around the time that there was a public field trip to Barnard Castle, that reduced by 5%, was replaced by feelings of kind of restlessness and content in the country. And we're seeing that trend continue. In more recent weeks, we've seen a slight uptick of 3% of levels of worry. My hypothesis on this is going to be, it's about the uncertainty of safety in sort of local areas. But equally, we're seeing still that growth in trend in terms of people who feel content and actually quite enjoying the change in lifestyle that this has brought about, and those that feel restless and angry and frustrated about not being able to get on with things. And it really has created such divergence in how we respond as a nation to it. And I'm sure you guys probably have this a lot, but even when I talk to clients, partners, suppliers, there's just such a different attitude in terms of where different businesses are at and people's intentions to go back to things that are normal. We all need to be very empathetic about it and supportive of each other throughout this period. In terms of our sense of community, and now one of the things I asked, well, we put on our recruitment, on our registration form, I should say, for these sessions, what is it you're looking forward to? We do our best to cover everything. As you can imagine, we get quite diverse responses. But interestingly, this week there are 2 or 3 requests for how has our sense of community changed. So I thought I'd dig into that a little bit more this week compared to previous weeks. Over time, you see quite an interesting pattern. Overall, though, it is very much about family and friends, where we feel our sense of community. In terms of our local area, which is that 3rd line down, we're seeing that around half of the UK feel a sense of community with our local area, and it is actually higher in suburbs and rural areas. So if you live in rural areas or suburban places, you might have noticed quite a change in terms of how we behave. We might have gotten to know our neighbours better. There might be more kind of community support and action. I've been lucky enough to spend my time between London and a rural part of Worcestershire during this pandemic, and it's been really quite touching to see how the different areas have responded. But certainly, my experience has been, in rural areas, it's been a bit more kind of what's the word? A little bit more forthcoming, I think, is probably the right terminology. So, but in terms of our communities, and it's just fascinating, we've got to think about this stuff. And why is it important? Why is it that if there is half of us feel that we have a sense of community with our local area, why is that important? And I think it's about everything, really. A think tank recently published data to show that footfall into city centres has dramatically fallen over this period, around 12 to 14% in some districts, around 20% in London. And what does it mean now? We've got school closures, we've got the slow return back to business. Not every business is opening its doors. Speaking to lots of companies that are talking about 2021, where they might open up doors and let people back. And that's going to have a huge impact on where we feel our sense of community. And if we're spending more time in an area, then based on what we've seen in people's desire to spend more in their homes and really invest, we're likely to see that happen and spread out into their communities to make better community experiences with people. So if we're seeing that ultimately, footfall is lower down into central business districts and key areas, it's not just the high street, but it's also the retail parks, it's all out of town, it's also the trading estates, which have been previously supporting the local cafes and things like this. It all has a big impact. And we've now got 13% of working families who are saying, they don't want to go back to the old normal. All right, it's been pretty stressful having the kids around, but actually they don't really want to go back to how things were. And as employees, for your employee value proposition, you need to really consider, well, how do we support people depending on how comfortable they are, depending on how safe they are? What is it about us as an employer that we can create a space where everybody can feel welcome and can work in a way that suits them? So it really does force this issue about remote working, but I think it forces it in a way that we haven't necessarily sort of had discussions about before. And with 44% of employers saying they're looking to reduce their physical space, I mean, that's massive when you think about it. If there's going to be potentially one trend, and I've been reading about this recently, about actually creating little kind of local siloed office spaces for teams to collaborate in more locally, as opposed to having that kind of centralized HQ, has a big impact then on where your community is, where you might get your coffee from in the morning, where you buy your lunch from, and all these things. Lots of our economy is set up to support business districts and home districts. That's all going to change. It's all going to be very different. And it's going to have a big impact in terms of where you know, retail wants to base itself and where services can position themselves in the market. And you look at, if you're a person like me, you like to go on the government websites to look at their free data. I think this is fascinating. This is, you can go and have a look. They publish this every week, and it shows you the percentage of usage across different modes of transport that are going on in the UK. So you can see this is just from the 13th of June to 29th of June. So what's that? You know, it's a couple of weeks of data. If you look, I think the interesting thing to look at this is that essentially all modes of transport are suppressed across all of them, with the exception of cycling, of course, which has been, you know, performed reasonably well. But across all modes, be it car, be it National Rail, Transport for London network as well, it's all quite suppressed. The tube usage is currently, I believe this is an estimated figure or a projected figure, is at 16%, and National Rail is at 11%. There's less of a desire for us to get out and engage. So with this kind of notion of communities, I think actually there's a real opportunity if businesses start to understand these dynamics. Because ultimately, despite the lockdown relaxing and people going back to work, what we're seeing is that for those that are much more concerned about their health, concerned about COVID-19, they're less likely to engage across every single category that we're measuring. And that type of attitude around, you know, your anxieties and your risk profile to your health isn't necessarily, it's just going to be a, you know, a flash in the pan type of attitude. It generally will, you know, stay with you for most of your life. So depending on, obviously, depending on life stages, there will be some dynamicism in that, but we're usually fairly set with these types of things. So that's going to have a big impact. We can't ignore the impact of sentiment, how people feel on commerce. I thought we'd do a little bit of a dive into sports, because obviously that's our diary studies looking at this, and we're going to be focusing on it in the coming weeks. So we'll have the return of the Premier League for those of you that are football fans. I thought, just to start it off, you know, I do love a poll. So I thought I'd ask you, to what extent are you a fan of football? I'm going to launch this. Hope you can see the poll. Just out of curiosity, because if you're not that interested in sport, maybe I can gloss over it. But actually, if you are quite a fan, maybe I'll cover it in a bit more detail. It's sort of being a bit live and dynamic as I do the content. Nice, over half of you voted. I'll give it another 5 seconds. Well, that was a long 5 seconds, wasn't it? Cool. Okay, so that is 71% of you voted. Cool. Close and share. Oh, right. Okay, so it's a split room. So you got some of those that, you know, not fans, and then you got 4% of super fans. Brilliant. Got a few in the room. Yeah, so obviously the interpretation of fan is sort of mixed in this. It's not the best question I've ever asked, I'll be honest, but it's for the purpose of the webinar. Provides me with a context, so thank you very much. As I'm from the Midlands, Aston Villa were our local team, so we don't really talk about football that much for obvious reasons. Hopefully you should be able to see the side. So there's been some change, obviously, with the way that, you know, the Premier League has been able to come back to life. In terms of its contribution to the economy, it's massive. You know, it's 7.6 billion contributed to the UK economy. 3.3 of that is in tax revenue. You know, match day, aside from match day tickets, season tickets, t-shirts, memorabilia, whatever, it's a huge driver. Again, we're talking about communities and where communities are based, and this is, you know, football stadiums and the local areas. They're steeped in history, they're steeped in emotion and support, and they support the local businesses. And there's rituals and habits that are so powerful that really bind communities together. So what is the impact if you bring that back, but yet you change the way that is experienced? I think the Premier League is a really interesting example of taking what is a really fundamental part of the UK's identity and seeing, well, what's the impact if you change the way that's delivered in terms of how people feel about it. And I think in looking through data, there's actually some really quite interesting opportunities. So overall, in terms of, if you measure it as an NPS score, so this is a standard way that you can, you measure experience based on subtracting your detractors from your advocates, is that we've seen a -1 NPS overall for those who are fans in general towards the game. So what that means is that there's a slight level of detraction, so people wouldn't necessarily recommend the games to others. But if you're a super fan, though, it doesn't stop that passion, that interest. So that 4% of you doesn't stop the kind of appetite for games. And it's interesting to see where how superfans are behaving. They're watching more games, they're actually gaming a lot online as well, but they're also doing more things outside of sport. So it sort of caused a bit of diversity in terms of the way that they're behaving. And in terms of the repertoire, there's an opportunity for sponsorship, advertising, product development in other kinds of areas, because they're getting their sports fix from elsewhere. I thought was quite cool about this is looking at the comparison down here for esports, for fans in general versus superfans. This has been a really interesting opportunity for companies to experiment with these sports and people to be more aware of what it is. So even though there's been a diminish in terms of the way that we've delivered the experience, doesn't mean to say the appetite isn't there. Of course, it definitely is. But it has meant there's been some real diversity in terms of the behaviour. So in the coming weeks, we'll be publishing our diary study, so you'll be able to get more of a preview on, what's the potential impact, what do their experiences look like, and what's important for businesses to think about as well. And in terms of, I thought it was quite interesting just looking at some of the response to the NPS data, is actually how social this all is and how much of this is about a community and it is about bringing people together. It's kind of like, for those of you who watch Queer Eye, Anthony on Queer Eye talks a lot about the importance of breaking bread at dinner to bring people together, and football has the same sort of thing, same sort of ritual. I thought this is quite a nice comment here from this football fan. He said, even with the games coming back, he felt that he was actually connecting with his friends a bit more. And okay, so what does that mean if you're building your community, still got your community, you're able to band together onto a single point of focus? Well, it's a wonderfully powerful thing in terms of decision making and how we spend our time. So I do think for those who might not necessarily be fans, 38% of you, I think it's an interesting one to kind of think about because of its contribution to the wider economy. And this kind of notion of community as well. So in terms of trends, sort of backing up a little bit, there's obviously concerns in terms of where those infections are happening and the diversity in terms of how we're feeling. What we're seeing in terms of people's hopes for the future, there is some real diversity now in terms of where they're looking forward spending their time. Yet we know that travel and tourism is a particular category they feel quite engaged in. In terms of our sense of community, it remains relatively similar as a pattern to where we've been before, but we also need to bear in mind that how our community bonds and where those bonds are has the potential to shift dramatically, not just because of where the pandemic is, but the way that businesses have been forced into making decisions to reduce their fixed overhead costs and operate differently. It's going to have a big impact, and we all need to be watching this and thinking about, how does that not just affect your day-to-day job, but how's it going to affect your customers? How's it going to affect the customers of your customers? It's really important, and we all need to be keeping a finger on the pulse with this sort of stuff. It's going back to the butterfly effect, which is something I was talking a lot about during April on the webinar series. So what about brand reputation? Those that have been on these webinars will know we're measuring how companies are perceived throughout the pandemic. So how well have they responded, and what's their level of trust and likability? It remains relatively, in terms of the top 10, in terms of levels of trust, they remain relatively stable in that top 10 set. But what we are seeing is those levels of trust, if you look from week commencing 30th through to now, do actually diminish a little bit. So there's an extent to which the pandemic and the way that it's created suboptimal experiences, both in kind of a physical sense, but also in terms of sort of brand message and consistency, has meant that actually it's diminished trust for lots of different companies. And I think some companies have really struggled to get it right. One theory or hypothesis that we had a few weeks ago was, well, when non-essential retail opens, people are able to go back, able to engage in brands the way they were able to before, we might see an improvement in terms of that level of trust. Unfortunately, it's not been the case. We're seeing still quite a flat line in terms of people's trust towards different retailers who've now got their doors open, which would indicate that there's potential sort of long-term damage that the pandemic's done, but also thinking about what the shopping experience is, it's definitely suboptimal. And when you look at data from customers about their experiences, there's aspects to which where, you know, window shopping, browsing, social time spent in city centres at the moment is clearly being diminished. And there's a question mark to be had around, well, how do we engage, create spaces in town centres to encourage people to come back? And I don't think it's necessarily on the retailers, but also the councils as well, in terms of how we can build that sense of community there. So there's lots of things to think about for sure. But if you look at the data across there, I just highlighted Argos and Burton as an example, two businesses that either perform well or not so well as a result of the pandemic. Burton, obviously, with the kind of uncertainty around their operating model, how they're going to perform, and to Philip Green's way he's responded to accessing government support has not been particularly popular, and the reopening of the retail space, our high street, hasn't really had much of an impact. Compare that to airlines. Now, this is really fascinating because it's been quite a bumpy ride for someone like BA, for, you know, quite frankly, understandable reasons, given what's going on out there in the press. But what we're seeing is this kind of uptick in more recent weeks across a few of the airlines, and when we're looking at the data, there's evidence where people are more inclined to book holidays, plan holidays, think about holidays. It's a sector that we're working in a bit at the moment, and it's a big question. However, what we are seeing is that still there is a diversity. Some people are looking forward to it, some people aren't. But in terms of trust, what this does indicate is actually BA as an organisation, looking across the UK, does have a relatively strong perception. Now, it's going to be a question whether they can weather the storm of it over time. And it really depends on how the market goes and how they respond. So in terms of reputation, the ultimate story here is that different categories are performing in different ways depending on our ability to access them. And obviously, there is a staggered approach to where the government is allowing different businesses to reopen, which will, of course, have an impact. So where we're going to go next, I'm going to give you an overview in terms of the different sectors in a bit of detail. And then, depending on time, we'll have time for Q&A as well. I'll tell you about the sort of things that we're going to be talking about. And if you do have any questions as I go through, feel free to write them into the questions box as we go, as they pop up. We have in recent weeks, because we share quite a lot of data, sometimes it's quite hard to kind of get all the narrative and all the questions, and then we get lots of emails that come in from people after sessions, and we do our best to answer them. But some of the questions, I think lots of people are looking for the answer to. So if you do want to ask anything, please feel free to do so. So in terms of the categories, we're seeing in the grocery market, quite interesting. We're seeing, looking across the press as well, there's lots of evidence that it's going back to some degree of normality. We are seeing at a local level that people are really supporting their local convenience stores. Visits to supermarkets remain relatively steady compared to the previous weeks. I think what's quite interesting, again, not to kind of labour the point, it's obviously one of the biggest stories of this, is we've seen last week that 57% of decision makers visited an online grocery website. Doesn't mean to say that they bought necessarily, but they're going there thinking about it. And that's consistent with data from that's in the industry. So Kantar published some data earlier that showed that in the last 4 weeks, online sales have jumped by an incredible 91% in online. So it's still, the appetite's there. You know, you can still physically go out and buy, but there's been some habit formation. There's been a change in the kind of life we want to live, the sort of lifestyle we want to live, and this really forced some quite important discussions in lots of households. And I think that does reflect it, that ultimately it's kind of potentially solving the problem of, you know, convenience and allowing us to spend more time together. And I wanted to understand, I'm going to throw it out to another poll for you, is, you know, what's important to you when you're buying products at the moment? When choosing a product, what's important to you? And I've given you 4 options. Obviously, there's a lot more you can pick, but it's just to give me a sense before we move into the next section. Cool. Around half of you voted. If the screen doesn't work, by the way, you can minimize the poll on your screen and you should be able to vote if you have any issues. That's the vast majority of you voted, so that's great. I'm going to close that and share the results. Interesting. So lots of So I suppose one aspect here is obviously, that's really interesting. Yeah. So quality comes out, 46% of you. Good online reviews, so the opinions of others also comes out, which might be reflective of the collective age of people are on the call. Value for money, we believe, is important as well. And actually, in reality, when you look at all these things, they all play a role. Okay, fine, good. Well, it's good to see that. Good to see the results. That thanks very much, and hopefully that provides a bit of context moving into the next slide. So one question that came out in the registration form was this idea of localism and how important it is. So we're working on a report at the moment about the sustainable opportunity for businesses in older generations. I think it's a massive opportunity that lots of companies need to be thinking about, and certainly one of the biggest trends we've had from the data that we've collected over the last few weeks. So we're going to be putting a report out about it. When you look at the total UK in terms of drivers of choice in a fairly sort of crude fashion, you see that yes, quality comes out, value for money, and these are two things that 46% of you said that's important. Then of course we've got price always plays a role in decision making. When you do conjoint analysis and things like that, it always plays a big role in terms of tipping the balance. But when you look at how older generations view things, it's really quite interesting. And I cast your eye to the right-hand side and look at the index. The index is effectively saying, how do 55s compare to the total UK population? So if I was to index that, what does it look like? What it tells us is that actually for older generations, they're more inclined to buy products and make choices based on whether they're sustainable, made in Great Britain, locally sourced, and they respect the health and safety conditions of their employees. Now, we had a question come in via the registration form and via email for the session about covering this kind of question of sustainability and the extent to which this is important. There's lots of analysis in the news about, people are interested in sustainability as a concept. Well, yeah, they are, but it's more nuanced. Some people don't necessarily have the kind of the privilege, and what I mean by privilege is the ability to think about it when they're kind of living day to day. It's not something you're able to, in some cases, think about when your back's against the wall. It's often something that's in some respects considered by those that either value it as a kind of core principle of their belief, but also as a society. If you look at the rest of Europe, they're much more adept to creating sustainable kind of communities. But if you look at the over 55s in terms of their decision making, they are more driven by these kind of factors. So I think there's certainly again opportunity for people who want to explore this particular age demographic. And so on our next webinar, so what we're going to be doing in the coming weeks is putting out reports on these key themes that we've seen. Obviously, we've got a bunch of data. We can obviously update you in these sessions and with our reports, but there's some really big trends that are coming out. We're going to be publishing a report in a couple of weeks and running a webinar where we're going to be discussing what the opportunity is, but I'll also be bringing in experts in different disciplines to discuss what businesses need to be thinking about. And it's going to be taking the research that we gather into more of an idea and innovation position, where we're going to start to think about, well, what can we do? How can we create sustainable growth with older generations? And when you look at the data, I mean, without going into too much detail, it's certainly the case that a lot of businesses, a lot of advertisers don't really think about kind of older generations in a particularly sophisticated way. So we're going to be discussing that on the 16th. So in terms of travel, we've seen in the last couple of weeks that behaviour is relatively steady in terms of people browsing holidays. So 30% of the UK were browsing at least once this week, compared to 29% 2 weeks ago. 24% of the UK were evaluating the costs of a destination at least once this week, and that's consistent with the last couple of weeks as well. So there's certainly a proportion of people who are thinking about it, but what is of concern is looking down the bottom for those who are in the industry, that we've got 29% of people who say, they're not planning on traveling for the foreseeable future. They don't want to do it. And that's consistent again with the sentiment analysis we've got. We've got a sizable proportion of people who are saying, actually, I feel worried, I feel concerned, I don't want to engage. And that's something to bear in mind. So when we're kind of hoping that, there's going to be a flood of people to the high street or a flood of people engaging when we open the doors, it's not what we're seeing. It really depends on what's important to the individual, and I would encourage any business to make sure that we're collecting that type of data to inform us on these sort of things. In terms of holiday plans, there is certainly a growing level of interest, a small growth of interest, I'd say, towards people browsing, evaluating and setting aside money to invest in holidays. But although we saw those kind of shocking scenes on the beaches in Bournemouth last week, we have to bear in mind that that is a proportion of society. It's not the whole of society, and what we see in the media is obviously designed in a way to kind of create the story, but it's much more nuanced than that in terms of what we're seeing. And it principally comes down to this level of concern. As you can see, when people aren't concerned about coronavirus, they're more likely to engage. You are concerned about it, you're less likely to. And it's a very simple dimension about people's health concerns and the level to which they will engage. I came across this really cool innovation in the Maldives off Springwise this week, and this is an interesting one where hotels built these beach bubbles where you can still get that kind of really unique experience on a beach in an isolated way. It's priced at a tasty €635 per night stay. It's kind of interesting. I think could be quite cool to do that. But of course, looking at it might be a luxury some can't afford at the moment. But I thought it was quite an interesting way of creating a kind of safe space where people can still get that level of experience that you can't find elsewhere. In terms of entertainment, we've seen that music is currently down 5 points based on a couple of weeks ago. We've still got a high proportion of people learning new skills. I've talked about this before, about new skill development and kind of productive use of time being a trend we need to think about. It will be one we'll focus on in the coming months in a bit more detail. What's kind of interesting actually is that if you look at employment, people who are employed are more likely to be taking on new creative skills compared to those that aren't. And it might be a reset in terms of people's balance of life and how they sort of balance their home life with their work life as well. So it's quite interesting to see that. We have seen that it's a reasonably consistent number of people watching TV and movies, and reading is still popular with older generations. So when you look at the data, if you kind of look at how the trends, hopefully you should be able to see my cursor there, but listening to music has diminished a little bit. Reading books as well obviously there's a lot of people going back to work. So yet at the same time, there's lots of new creative skills that have been learned. So I still think there's lots of opportunity in the sector. It's one, of course, where the UK government have been under the cosh for not supporting the entertainment industry enough. And so I think this potential for it to be going online for the foreseeable future remains to be the case. So there's plenty of opportunity, I think, in there. And in terms of home and DIY, there's a simple message here in terms of the most recent weeks, which is that the going back to work and for lots of people, and sort of the sort of regular patterns starting to come back a little bit, has impacted people's intention to do DIY. We're still seeing that 21% of people are doing it on a regular basis. It's really quite high. It's been, again, one of the success stories of the pandemic. And gardening is also high as a kind of sanctuary away, from your home life. But overall, we're seeing a level of suppression of engagement to the DIY sector. Lots of people are also bringing in contractors to sort out things they may not necessarily develop the skills for. But it's going to be interesting in the coming months what the opportunities are going to be here. And I think also in terms of, I put there about cooking. So, we're going to have restaurants opening, more available takeaways and that sort of thing. So what does that mean for people cooking on a daily basis? Since the lockdown started to ease, the trends have remained relatively steady across all the categories measured, but there is a slight decrease in DIY cooking and cleaning, but only about 3 to 4% across those. And it's going to be related to the easing of the lockdown, but also the weather as well. It's going to have an impact. One of the sort of main areas, I think, for discussion, of course, is retail and how that's responding. We've seen 4% of people looking forward to shopping. It's consistent for the past couple of weeks in terms of what they're looking forward to. But there's evidence to suggest that actually they're less likely to be converting in some stores. So there's some data from British Land saying that 64% of their assets are currently open, but like-for-like retail sales of those that are open were 91% of what they were same week last year. So it would indicate that, you know, even though they're open, people might not necessarily be spending as much, might be kind of being very mission focused. Got to go into town to get a flex kettle, power cable, tungsten screws, a shower curtain, and some biscuits. And I have just described a scene in Alan Partridge, but there could be things that you're looking for as well. So they might be going for very specific things and not window shopping as much as they were. Looking at some more qualitative data around this is what you're seeing. Lots of people saying, you know, I wanted to come in and see what the latest deals were at Shop X. I wanted to get my things and get out. And that's because it's a suboptimal experience. And a lot of retail, you know, really is all about the senses and evoking the feeling to encourage people to spend time well there with their friends. And we're seeing that experience being heavily disrupted by all these additional barriers. So not only with the opening of the high street, you know, the expectation was that we're going to see the high streets flooding, but where people are spending their time in the category, still showing, for example, with clothing, people are more likely to be spending time looking for clothes and buying clothes online than they are in store, despite the fact that the shops are open. And if you compare across different categories across the week, we've organised this so you can just very simply see online versus in store across different categories. But there's no indication in the data yet to suggest there is this swap back to in-store purchase, and we've seen that in our data. 2 weeks ago, I presented back this kind of switching to online purchase, and I've been lucky enough, very fortunate enough, to interview different business leaders in retail, part of a report we're putting out on the 55 plus market. And that's something that comes out. I spoke to a fascinating contributor, CEO of a really large retailer, who told me that the interesting thing is not only have they seen a growth in e-commerce, but sales volumes, call volumes into the call center have just shot up as well. And it's amongst older generations. And how the biggest challenge for their business is how do you manage that as a consumer experience? How do you manage that operationally? How do you account for it? And if you speak to a product experience expert, they'll tell you we shouldn't need to have telephones. You should have a decent enough digital experience to not need it. So it does cause this kind of conflict, I think, in the industry about, you know, how do we create experiences that cater for all? But certainly, speaking to the CEO of this business, they've seen really great performance because they've kept their channel distribution as broad and as open as possible. They've created optionality, and that's going to be a really important coping mechanism into the future. For beauty, online is still strong, but similar to retail, just sort of jumping through this, these slides will be available to download after the session, by the way, is again, we're not seeing much evidence of a strong return back to purchasing on the high street. It's going to take a bit of time, if it is indeed ever going to happen. And of course, no one can really predict that at the moment. In terms of exercise, it remains relatively steady. Around 1 in 4 of us, you know, are out walking every day as a form of exercise. Got a similar proportion of people who are running at least once a week. It's interesting to sort of compare. I was quite taken by the proportion of men and women who are working out, which feels, you know, relatively similar. Actually, there's only about a 5% difference between the two. And good news for gyms is that 87% of people plan to continue their gym membership in July when the gyms reopen. So there's plenty of, I think, good news for gyms. So yeah, hopefully, you know, we've certainly seen people take their behaviour online. We haven't necessarily seen as much new growth in this sector, but I think the hope for lots of businesses will be that, you know, the gyms are also a source of community in lots of places. So I'm hoping that will become, you know, be a feature again in the not too distant future. This is a really cool innovation that I came across from a business called, I think you could describe this as Suunto. I'm not from Finland, but it's a Finnish business, and they've created a product which allows you to see what popular running routes exist, so that you can actually pick a different path and remain safe. It's also probably quite an interesting one when lockdown is relaxed and it's safe to return, where you can actually see what are the popular routes to run and learn about new places to go. But certainly the intention is to help people avoid more popular routes. It's quite a cool little product. Any of you are keen runners? I'm not on the guilty party of that one, but it's quite cool to sort of see, to give that a go and sort of see, see whether it does work. But it's yeah, interesting kind of new product, a new way of solving a real problem about safety in a quite stylish way as well, I think. In terms of alcohol, we're seeing that it's quite a staggering amount. 3% of people are buying drinks every day. It's still the case that those who are employed are more likely to be drinking at the moment than those who are unemployed. 6% of men are drinking every day compared to 2% of women. So there is a bit of a difference in sort of gender as well. And one growth opportunity is in low alcohol products, and it's created quite a diverse response to things. Some people are, have decided actually they're going to use it as a coping mechanism. Some people are still enjoy the taste of alcohol and the moments of alcohol, but are going for low alcohol options as a result. And in fact, there's data to suggest that over the month of April, the category of non-alcoholic drinks grew by 14%. It's really quite big when you think about it. It's still very much a social activity, so you're more likely to be drinking with others at home than on your own. But there's added dimension now that pubs are open, so what's going to happen when people are able to get out and about and experience it? What's that going to mean? That's going to be significant changes, I think, we see in terms of people's engagement with the category. So plenty there. I think sort of the key themes across the category is still the growth of online, the sort of issue around creating a compelling experience on the high street. It needs to be thought of, I think, more long-term than short-term to create the optionality. I think lots of businesses need to be thinking longer term with their estate and how they're going to manage that. So plenty of questions. What you can expect from us over the next 3 weeks. So we'll be publishing our next report on the 9th of July. And then we'll be running the first in our trends deep dive analysis on our ideas and innovations webinar, which is all going to be about how we need to have a conversation about older generations and how businesses need to take it seriously. Anecdotally, I can tell you, working for 15 years of different businesses, it's something I've always been surprised actually how many companies really take older generations seriously. It's not that many really, from my experience across lots of different sectors. And I think we need to really have a conversation about it. And we've got the data to support that. And so I'll be joined by an expert who'll be talking about, what are the things to think about, and it's going to be very much moving from research into product, moving into how we can generate ideas to solve those issues. And then that report will be released the following week. And later in July, we'll also be publishing our data in partnership with the IPA on the Premier League, as well as doing another update on the data towards the end of the month as well. So there's plenty of stuff we're still doing. Like lots of businesses, we're obviously sort of trying to keep up with the change in the picture to enable you to get the most out of your time on these sessions. So any feedback is much appreciated. So I'll move that to any questions that might have come in since we started. I've actually lost, I need to find where I put the questions box. Where's that gone? Seems to have gone from my window. It's not very useful, is it? Let me see. Okay, there's a few questions here. A question here. Is the online versus in-store or week versus week per the key? So there's a question here just about the data, whether presented, whether it's looking at per week in retail. Yes. So the data we've got is the last 7 days. We do, I think entertainment, what I showed was last 3 days, but the data I showed for the difference between online and in-store was all per week, I think. I'll check for you if you've got any more questions. Another question here. Do you have any insight on companies companies opening up their office. Effectively, this is a question around, do we have any questions around companies opening their offices? Well, yeah, there's not a lot of data. I mean, I think the best place to kind of get that type of information at the moment is definitely the CBI have got plenty of it. Chamber of Commerce have got plenty of it as well. We're not, although we do capture different types of businesses in the data we get anyway. So job title, type of category, we look at it more in the kind of consumer set that we have. But if you've got any questions specifically, we can obviously look at it. We're working for different businesses at the moment on those types of questions, but it's more what's outside of our public data. Does that make sense? Cool. Okay, it's just a couple of questions that come in today. So the next thing you can expect from us, of course, will be our webinar in a couple of weeks, and report will be out next week. Have a great rest of your Thursday. Thanks very much for attending. I will see you all soon.